Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in Washington, D.C. in April of 1865 was thick with a strange, unfamiliar scent. Peace. For 4 long, brutal years, the city had been a fortress, the nerve center of a nation tearing itself apart. The unfinished dome of the Capitol building had loomed over streets filled with soldiers, hospitals overflowing with the wounded, and a populace gripped by the constant grinding anxiety of war. But now the cannons were falling silent. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered his army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. The rebellion was broken. The Union, scarred and bleeding but whole, had survived. Washington erupted. Bonfires lit the night sky, illuminating the cheering crowds that surged through the avenues. Buildings were draped in flags, and for the first time in a generation, the capital city could breathe. It was a city desperate for normalcy, for a return to the simple pleasures of life that war had stolen. And on the evening of Good Friday, April 14th, the city's most powerful man, the architect of its victory, decided to indulge in one of those simple pleasures. President Abraham Lincoln, weary from the immense burdens of his office, sought a brief respite at the theater. Ford's Theater on 10th Street was packed, a full house of over 1,700 people eager to see the celebrated British comedy, Our American Cousin. The play was a light, frothy affair, a perfect distraction. The presidential box, draped with flags and a portrait of George Washington, was occupied by the President and the First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln, along with a young couple, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. The mood was buoyant. Laughter echoed through the hall. The war was over. The future, uncertain as it was, held the promise of reunion and reconstruction. But outside the theater, in the damp alleyways and shadowed streets of the capital, a different kind of drama was reaching its climax. It was a tragedy of fanaticism, of grievance, and of blood. Its lead actor was a man intimately familiar with the stage, a man whose meticulously good looks and theatrical pedigree masked a soul, curdled by political hatred. He knew the rhythms of a play, the power of a dramatic entrance, the importance of a well-timed line. And on this night he had cast himself in the role of a lifetime, the avenging angel of a lost cause. Inside Ford's Theater, the play reached one of its comedic high points. The audience roared with laughter. It was the perfect moment. The sound would cover the noise. A small, dark figure slipped unseen into the back of the presidential box. He raised a single-shot Derringer pistol, small enough to be concealed in the palm of his hand. He aimed it at the back of the president's head, and in the space of a single heartbeat, amid the sound of celebration, the future of the United States was irrevocably altered. The shot, when it came, was a muffled pop, almost lost in the wave of laughter from the stage. But it was followed by a scream, and then a man impossibly vaulted from the presidential box 12 feet down to the stage. He landed awkwardly, a bone in his leg snapping, but adrenaline and theatrical instinct propelled him to his feet. He raised a bloodied knife high in the air, and in a voice trained to fill concert halls, he delivered his line to the stunned and silent audience: Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, the state motto of Virginia. And with that, John Wilkes Booth, one of the most famous actors in America, vanished into the darkness behind the set, leaving behind a dying president and a nation plunged back into shock and horror. Tonight, we don't just examine the murder of a president. We dissect the anatomy of a political conspiracy, a sprawling, desperate plot designed not just to kill a man, but to decapitate a government and plunge a newly healing nation back into the abyss of war. We will trace the web of plotters drawn into one man's narcissistic crusade, follow the frantic 12-day manhunt for a killer who believed he would be hailed as a hero, and explore the swift, controversial justice that followed, a justice that would leave questions that linger to this day. This is the story of a crime that was also an act of war, the final bloody battle of the American Civil War. To understand the conspiracy, we must first understand its author, John Wilkes Booth. He was not some shadowy fringe figure. He was, by the standards of his day, an A-list celebrity. Born into the most famous acting family in America, the Barrymores of their time, Booth was handsome, charismatic, and wealthy. He was a theatrical star in his own right, known for his energetic, athletic performances, particularly in Shakespearean roles. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. He moved in the highest circles of society, a man who could command a stage and a room with equal ease. But beneath the polished veneer of the stage idol lay a fanatic. Booth was a virulent, unapologetic racist, and a fervent sympathizer for the Confederate cause. He viewed the South as a noble, chivalrous society defending its rights against the tyranny of the North. And at the head of that tyranny, in Booth's mind, was one man, Abraham Lincoln. To Booth, Lincoln was not a president. He was a despot, a king, a Caesar who had trampled the Constitution and waged a bloody war to subjugate a free people. This was not a rational political disagreement. It was a white-hot, all-consuming hatred. For much of the war, Booth had used his status as a traveling actor to serve as a clandestine courier and spy for the Confederacy. But as the Southern cause began to crumble in late 1864, his desperation grew. He became obsessed with the idea of a grand, dramatic gesture that could single-handedly turn the tide. He began to assemble a small, motley crew of Confederate sympathizers, drifters, and malcontents who met at a boarding house in Washington, D.C. run by a widow named Mary Surratt. It was here that the original plot was born. The initial plan was not assassination. It was kidnapping. Booth's scheme was as theatrical as one of his plays. He and his team would ambush Lincoln's carriage on a quiet road, overpower the president, and spirit him away to Richmond, the Confederate capital. There, they would hold him hostage, trading his life for the release of thousands of Confederate prisoners of war, who could then rejoin the fight and save the Confederacy from defeat. It was a desperate, audacious plan, and Booth pursued it with monomaniacal fervor. His team was a collection of men bound to him by his charisma and their shared grievances. There was Lewis Powell, a towering, physically powerful former Confederate soldier from Florida who had been wounded at Gettysburg. He was quiet, loyal, and capable of immense brutality. There was David Harold, a young, impressionable pharmacy clerk from Washington who knew the backroads of southern Maryland like the back of his hand, an essential guide for their escape. And there was George Atzerodt, a German-born carriage painter and boatman whose knowledge of the Potomac River was meant to be key to spiriting Lincoln across to Virginia. Others, like Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Loughlin, were former schoolmates of Booth's, drawn into the scheme by a sense of adventure and misguided loyalty. The group rehearsed. They scouted locations. They were ready. Their chosen date was March 17, 1865. Booth learned that Lincoln was scheduled to attend a play at a hospital on the outskirts of Washington. This was their chance. The conspirators lay in wait on the road armed and ready. But the president never came. At the last minute, Lincoln had changed his plans to attend a ceremony at a hotel in the city. The kidnapping plot had failed before it even began. The conspirators scattered, their morale shattered. Booth's grand gesture had dissolved into a humiliating farce. For a few weeks, the plot lay dormant. Then came April. On April 9th, Lee surrendered. The war was effectively over. Richmond fell. For the South, it was a catastrophe. For Booth, it was a personal apocalypse. His cause was dead. His dreams of glory were turning to ash. His hatred for Lincoln, however, only intensified. The final, decisive moment came on the evening of April 11th. From the balcony of the White House, Lincoln delivered a speech outlining his vision for Reconstruction. He spoke of bringing the Southern states back into the Union with malice toward none. But then he uttered a phrase that, to one man in the crowd below, was the ultimate blasphemy. Lincoln suggested that certain African Americans, the very intelligent, and those who had served as soldiers, should be granted the right to vote. John Wilkes Booth was in that crowd. He turned to his companion, Lewis Powell, and seethed, "That means nigger citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through." That is the last speech he will ever make. The last thread of restraint snapped. The plot was no longer about kidnapping. It was now about murder. It was about vengeance. Booth didn't just want to exchange a hostage. He wanted to create a martyr for his own lost cause, and in doing so, throw the Union government into such chaos that the Confederacy might somehow, miraculously, rise from the grave. The morning of Good Friday, April 14, 1865, began like any other for John Wilkes Booth. He went about his day in Washington, a man of purpose, moving through a city of celebration. Around noon, he stopped by Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. It was then that he learned the news that would crystallize his murderous ambition into a concrete plan. A theater employee told him that President Lincoln and General Ulysses S. Grant would be attending that evening's performance of Our American Cousin. This was it, the opportunity he had been waiting for. The setting was perfect, his own domain, the theater where he was master. The news galvanized Booth into a whirlwind of activity. General Grant's presence meant a double prize, a chance to eliminate both the political and military heads of the Union in one night. Booth's vision expanded. This would not be a single assassination. It would be a coordinated, three-pronged strike designed to decapitate the federal government. He would handle Lincoln himself. He assigned his most ruthless follower, Lewis Powell, the task of assassinating Secretary of State William Seward, who was at home recuperating from a serious carriage accident. The third target was Vice President Andrew Johnson, who was next in the line of succession. That assignment fell to George Atzerodt. The goal was pure chaos. With the President, Vice President, and Secretary of State all dead, Booth believed the Union government would collapse, creating a power vacuum the South could exploit. He spent the afternoon making his preparations with chilling meticulousness. He went to the theater and, feigning a need to see the owner, gained access to the presidential box. Alone, he bored a small peephole in the door that led into the box, allowing him to see exactly where his target would be sitting. He also carved a small niche in the outer door of the corridor, so he could jam it shut with a wooden plank, preventing anyone from interfering from the outside. He then went to a nearby stable and arranged for his getaway horse, a fast bay mare, to be ready for him that evening. Throughout the day, he met with his co-conspirators to give them their final instructions. He met David Harold and instructed him to guide Lewis Powell to Seward's house and then rendezvous with Booth outside the city after the deed was done. He met with Powell, a man who rarely questioned orders, and handed him a revolver and a large knife. His most difficult meeting was with George Atzerodt. Atzerodt was a boatman and a petty criminal, not a cold-blooded killer. When Booth told him he was to murder the vice president in his room at the Kirkwood House Hotel, Atzerodt balked. He had signed on for a kidnapping, he protested, not a murder. Booth was furious, bullying and threatening him, telling him it was too late to back out. A shaken Atzerodt took the knife and gun Booth gave him, but his resolve was already crumbling. Mary Surratt also played her part that day. Booth gave her a small package containing binoculars, and instructed her to travel to her tavern in Surrattsville, Maryland, a key stop on his planned escape route. He told her to give the package to the innkeeper, and tell him to have the shooting irons, 2 carbines that had been hidden there weeks before, ready for a party that would be calling for them that night. As evening fell, Booth's plan was set. He learned that General Grant and his wife had changed their plans and would not be at the theater, a minor frustration but not a deterrent. He dressed in his finest clothes, a man preparing for his greatest performance. He had a drink at a saloon next to the theater, steadying his nerves. He knew the play by heart. He knew the exact line, the one that always drew the biggest laugh, during which he would strike. The stage was set. His audience was waiting. At approximately 10:15 p.m., as the third act of Our American Cousin unfolded on the stage of Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth made his move. He slipped quietly up the stairs to the dress circle and showed his card to a presidential messenger who let him pass. He moved down the short, dimly lit corridor toward the presidential box. He paused at the door, peering through the small hole he had drilled earlier. He could see the back of Lincoln's head, silhouetted against the stage lights. He waited. He placed the wooden plank he had brought against the door, jamming it shut. He was now sealed in with his prey. On stage, the actor Harry Hawk delivered his laugh line. "Don't know the manners of good society, E.H.? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sockdologizing old mantrap." The audience erupted in laughter. In that moment, Booth opened the inner door to the box, stepped inside, and fired his .44 caliber Derringer. The small lead ball entered Lincoln's head behind his left ear, tore through his brain, and lodged behind his right eye. The president's head slumped forward. Mary Todd Lincoln, initially thinking he was asleep, soon realized the horrific truth and screamed. Major Henry Rathbone, reacting instantly, lunged at Booth, but the assassin was prepared. He dropped the pistol and drew a large dagger, slashing wildly at Rathbone, slicing his arm from elbow to shoulder, nearly to the bone. Freeing himself, Booth clambered onto the railing of the box. He leaped for the stage, but his spur caught on the Treasury Guard flag decorating the box, disrupting his descent. He landed off balance, his left fibula cracking just above the ankle. A searing pain shot through his leg, but a lifetime of stage training and a surge of adrenaline allowed him to recover. He struck a dramatic pose, shouted his defiant line, and limped across the stage, disappearing through a side door into the night. At the exact same time, a scene of even more savage, chaotic violence was unfolding a few blocks away at the home of Secretary of State William Seward. Lewis Powell, guided by David Harold, arrived at the Seward residence on Lafayette Square. Harold waited outside with the horses while Powell, playing the part of a messenger from Seward's doctor, knocked on the door. He was told by a servant that the secretary was asleep and could not be disturbed. Powell insisted, claiming he had medicine that had to be delivered in person. He pushed his way inside and started up the stairs. He was met at the top of the landing by Seward's son, Frederick. When Frederick refused him entry to his father's bedroom, Powell's pretense dissolved. He pulled his revolver, aimed it at Frederick's head, and pulled the trigger. The gun misfired with a dull click. Powell didn't hesitate. He began beating Frederick over the head with the heavy barrel of the pistol. fracturing his skull and leaving him for dead on the floor. He then burst into the secretary's bedroom. Inside, Seward's daughter Fanny screamed as Powell threw himself upon the bedridden Secretary of State. Seward was wearing a metal brace around his neck and jaw from his recent carriage accident, a device that would ultimately save his life. Powell began stabbing frantically and blindly at Seward's head and throat. The brace deflected many of the blows, but Powell managed to slice open Seward's cheek and neck, causing baths of bleeding. Another of Seward's sons, Augustus, and a soldier nurse, Sergeant George Robinson, rushed into the room and wrestled with the powerful attacker. Powell fought like a cornered animal, stabbing Robinson in the shoulder and forehead and slashing Augustus on his head and hands. After wounding yet another man, a State Department messenger named Emmerich Hansel, who had arrived at the commotion, Powell finally broke free. He ran down the stairs, shouted, I'm mad," burst out the front door, and fled into the night, his work, he believed, complete. While blood was being shed at Ford's Theater and the Seward Mansion, the third part of the conspiracy was collapsing into a pathetic failure. George Atzerodt, tasked with killing Vice President Andrew Johnson, had checked into the same hotel, the Kirkwood House. He went to the bar and began to drink, his courage failing him with every glass. He asked the bartender about the vice president's habits, but he never made a move. He lost his nerve completely. Around the time Booth was pulling the trigger, Atzerodt was wandering drunk and aimless through the streets of Washington. He had abandoned his post. He eventually tossed away his knife and pawned his revolver. His role in the great conspiracy reduced to a drunken, cowardly footnote. The plot to decapitate the government had failed, but it had succeeded in murdering the president. Back at Ford's Theater, chaos reigned. For a moment, the audience was paralyzed, unsure if the events were part of the play. But the First Lady's piercing screams and Major Rathbone's cries of, "Stop that man," shattered the illusion. A young doctor in the audience, Charles Leal, was the first to reach the presidential box. He found the president slumped in his rocking chair, paralyzed and struggling to breathe. Dr. Leal quickly identified the gunshot wound and realized it was mortal. There was nothing to be done. Soldiers carried the dying president out of the theater, across the muddy street, to a humble boarding house owned by a tailor named William Peterson. They laid him diagonally on a bed that was too small for his tall frame. As the night wore on, the small back bedroom filled with cabinet members, generals, and doctors, all standing a silent, helpless vigil. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, a man known for his iron will, arrived and effectively took control of the United States government from a corner of the room. He began issuing orders, interviewing witnesses, and launching the largest manhunt in American history. As the sun rose on the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln drew his last breath. He was 56 years old. Standing over the bed, Stanton uttered the famous, solemn epitaph, "Now he belongs to the ages." While a nation reeled in grief, two fugitives were riding hard through the Maryland countryside. John Wilkes Booth had escaped Ford's Theater through a back alley, mounted his waiting horse, and galloped into the night. A few miles outside of Washington, he rendezvoused with David Harold, who had fled the scene of the Seward attack after hearing Powell's frantic cries. The two men were now on the run together. Booth's leg was causing him excruciating pain, the broken bone grating with every movement of the horse. They were fugitives, but they were following a pre-planned escape route. Their first stop was Surratt's Tavern in Surrattsville. They arrived around midnight, collected the weapons Mary Surratt had told the innkeeper to have ready, and took a bottle of whiskey. Booth, ever the actor, boasted to the innkeeper about their deeds. though he didn't learn until later that Powell had failed to kill Seward. From there, they rode on through the darkness, Booth's leg swelling and the pain becoming unbearable. He knew he needed medical attention, and he knew just where to go. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, they arrived at the farmhouse of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a physician and Southern sympathizer whom Booth had met on previous occasions. Mudd was awakened by their frantic knocking. He brought the two men inside, examined Booth's leg, and diagnosed a clean fracture of the fibula. He set the bone and fashioned a makeshift splint. Booth and Harold rested at the Mudd farmhouse for several hours. And it is here that one of the case's most enduring controversies begins. Dr. Mudd would later claim that he did not recognize Booth, who had shaved his signature mustache and was using a false name. He insisted he was merely a doctor fulfilling his duty to treat an injured man, and that he had no idea of the assassination until later that day. The prosecution, however, would paint a very different picture. They argued that Mudd was a willing and knowledgeable accomplice. He had met with Booth before, had introduced him to other Confederate agents, and was deeply involved in the initial kidnapping plot. They contended that Mudd knew exactly who he was treating and precisely what he had done, and that he intentionally aided the assassin's escape. Whether Mudd was a country doctor caught in a terrible situation or a committed conspirator remains a subject of intense debate to this day. What is certain is that after setting Booth's leg, he gave the fugitives directions and sent them on their way deeper into the sympathetic territory of southern Maryland. Meanwhile, the manhunt, orchestrated by the tireless Edwin Stanton, was exploding across the country. Stanton had immediately ordered all roads and bridges leading out of Washington to be closed, but Booth and Harold had slipped through just moments before the order took effect. Thousands of federal troops were mobilized. The entire country became a network of informants. Stanton offered a staggering $100,000 reward, the equivalent of millions of dollars today, for the capture of Booth and his accomplices. The reward poster, featuring photographs of Booth, Harold, and a man named John Surratt, Mary's son, also a suspect, was plastered in every post office and public square in the nation. The fugitives' next challenge was a formidable one. The dense and sprawling Zakiah Swamp. For nearly 5 days, Booth and Harold hid in a thick pine thicket on the edge of the swamp, their movements severely limited by Booth's injury and the massive military presence combing the area. They were aided by Confederate sympathizers, most notably a man named Thomas Jones, who brought them food and newspapers. From the papers, Booth learned the terrible truth of his situation. The press was not hailing him as a heroic liberator. They were branding him a vile and cowardly murderer. The South, for which he had committed this terrible act, was condemning him. His grand theatrical gesture had been a miscalculation of monumental proportions. He was not a hero. He was a pariah. His diary, which he kept during this time, reveals a man descending into a spiral of self-pity and delusion. "I am here in despair," he wrote, "and why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, and yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat." He could not comprehend why the world did not see the nobility of his act. While Booth was hiding in the swamp, the dragnet was closing in on his fellow conspirators. George Atzerodt was arrested on April 20th at his cousin's house in Maryland after arousing suspicion by talking too freely about the events in Washington. Lewis Powell, wounded and lost, managed to hide out for 3 days before making a fatal mistake. On the evening of April 17th, disguised as a common laborer, he showed up at Mary Surratt's boarding house, the one place in the city that was under intense surveillance. As federal detectives were questioning Mrs. Surratt inside, Powell knocked on the door. His story that he was there to dig a gutter was unconvincing, and Mary Surratt denied knowing him, a lie that would help seal her fate. Powell was arrested on the spot. Edmund Spangler, the stagehand from Ford's, was arrested, as were Booth's old friends, Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Loughlin. Dr. Mudd was arrested at his farm after giving contradictory statements to investigators, and Mary Surratt was taken into custody, becoming the central female figure in the conspiracy. The net had been cast. After 5 miserable days in hiding, Thomas Jones finally deemed it safe enough for Booth and Harold to attempt the next crucial step of their escape, crossing the Potomac River into Virginia. He provided them with a small fishing boat. Under the cover of darkness, on April 20th, they set out. But in their haste and disorientation, they rowed in the wrong direction and ended up back in Maryland. Exhausted and frustrated, they hid for another day before making a second attempt. This time, on the night of April 22nd, they succeeded, finally landing on the Virginia shore. They had reached the heartland of the defeated Confederacy, a land Booth expected would welcome him with open arms. He was wrong. The Virginians who helped him, a series of farmers and former Confederate agents, did so reluctantly. They viewed his act not as a blow for freedom, but as a dishonorable murder that would only bring more suffering upon the South. He was passed from one safe house to another, an unwelcome burden. His reception was not the hero's welcome he had envisioned, but the grudging assistance given to a desperate fugitive. Their journey finally led them to the farm of Richard Garrett, a tobacco farmer, just south of the Rappahannock River. Booth told Garrett he was a wounded Confederate soldier returning home. The Garretts, suspecting nothing, took the 2 men in. But their suspicions grew as they saw Federal cavalry patrols sweeping the area. Fearing the men would steal their horses, the Garretts suggested they sleep in the farm's tobacco barn for safety. On the night of April 25th, Booth and Harold, their 12-day flight nearly at an end, settled into the barn for the night. They were trapped. In the early morning hours of April 26, 1865, the 16th New York Cavalry, acting on a tip, descended on the Garrett farm. They quickly surrounded the tobacco barn where Booth and Harold were sleeping. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Edward Doherty, called for the men inside to surrender. After a tense negotiation, David Harold lost his nerve and gave himself up. Emerging from the barn with his hands in the air, he told the soldiers that his companion had no intention of being taken alive. John Wilkes Booth remained defiant. The soldiers gave him one last chance to surrender. "I will not be taken alive," he shouted back. An officer, Lieutenant Everton Conger, decided to force him out. He ordered his men to set the barn on fire. Dry hay and wood quickly ignited, and flames began to engulf the structure. The inside of the barn was illuminated like a stage, casting Booth's silhouette against the burning walls. He was visible through the slats of the barn, armed with a carbine and a revolver, limping about as if looking for a way to fight his way out. One of the soldiers, a sergeant named Boston Corbett, was watching Booth through a crack in the wall. Corbett was a religious fanatic who had castrated himself years earlier to avoid temptation. He saw Booth raise his carbine as if to fire on the soldiers outside. In that moment, Corbett made a decision. Against direct orders not to shoot, he raised his own cavalry revolver, took aim, and fired. The bullet struck Booth in the back of the neck, severing his spinal cord. It was almost the exact spot where Booth had shot Lincoln. Booth collapsed, to the floor of the barn, paralyzed. The soldiers rushed in and dragged his body out of the fire, laying him on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. He was dying, but he remained conscious for several hours. He was unable to move his limbs, and he whispered to the soldiers, "Tell my mother I die for my country." As he looked at his paralyzed hands, he uttered his final words, "Useless, useless." At sunrise, John Wilkes Booth, the assassin who craved glory, died an ignominious death on the dusty porch of a Virginia farmhouse. The manhunt was over, but the final act of the tragedy, the trial of his co-conspirators, was about to begin. With Booth dead and his accomplices in custody, a grieving and vengeful nation demanded justice. The question was what form that justice would take. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and the new president, Andrew Johnson, made a decision that remains controversial to this day. The 8 accused conspirators would not be tried in a civilian court. They would face a military tribunal. The administration's justification was that Lincoln was the commander-in-chief of the army, and his assassination during a time of war was an act of war itself. The conspirators, they argued, were unlawful enemy combatants. This decision had profound consequences. A military tribunal operated under different rules than a civilian court. There would be no jury of peers, but a panel of 9 military officers. A simple majority was needed for a guilty verdict, and a 2/3 majority for a death sentence. The rules of evidence were far looser, allowing for hearsay and circumstantial evidence that would be inadmissible in a regular courtroom. And the defense attorneys, appointed by the court, were given very little time to prepare their cases. The entire proceeding was designed for speed and a certain outcome, conviction. The trial began on May 9, 1865, in a crowded room at the Old Arsenal Penitentiary in Washington. The 8 prisoners sat together on a raised platform, manacled and, for the first part of the trial, forced to wear restrictive hoods whenever they were outside the courtroom. They were a pathetic-looking group, a far cry from the revolutionary cabal Booth had envisioned. Lewis Powell, massive and stoic, sat silently, seemingly resigned to his fate. David Harold appeared terrified. George Atzerodt was a nervous wreck. Dr. Samuel Mudd and Samuel Arnold protested their innocence, and at the end of the row sat Mary Surratt, a 42-year-old widow dressed in black, her face hidden behind a veil. The prosecution, led by Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt, had a twofold objective. The first was to prove that each of the 8 defendants had played a role, however small, in the broad conspiracy that led to Lincoln's murder. The second, more ambitious goal was to prove that the conspiracy was not merely the work of Booth and his small band, but that it was a plot orchestrated and funded by the highest levels of the Confederate government, including its president, Jefferson Davis. This second claim was never substantiated with credible evidence, but it fueled the trial's atmosphere of wartime retribution. Over 6 weeks, the tribunal heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses. The case against some of the defendants was overwhelming. Lewis Powell's brutal attack on the Seward household was described in grim detail. David Harold's role as Booth's guide and companion on his flight was undeniable. George Atzerott's own drunken confessions and the testimony of those he had spoken to in his panic sealed his fate. The evidence showed that he had been assigned the role of killing the vice president, and in the eyes of the court, his failure to carry it out did not absolve him of his part in the conspiracy. The cases against the others were more complex. Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Loughlin readily admitted their involvement in the original kidnapping plot, but insisted they had withdrawn from the conspiracy long before it turned to assassination. Edmund Spangler, the Ford's theater stagehand, was accused of helping Booth escape, a charge based on flimsy and contradictory testimony. The most contentious cases were those of Dr. Mudd and Mary Surratt. Mudd's defense team argued passionately that he was an innocent physician who had simply tended to an unexpected patient. The prosecution presented evidence of his prior meetings with Booth and his Southern sympathies, painting him as a key logistical supporter of the plot. But it was the case of Mary Surratt that captured the most public attention and generated the most doubt. The prosecution portrayed her as the den mother of the conspiracy, arguing that she had used her boarding house as a nest for the plotters, and had actively aided Booth's escape. The key testimony against her came from a boarder named Louis Weichman, who detailed the frequent meetings between Booth and the others at the house, and from the innkeeper, who testified that Surratt had told him to have the guns ready on the day of the assassination. Her defense argued that she was a simple widow, unaware of the true nature of her son's and Booth's activities, but her denial of knowing Lewis Powell on the night of his arrest, a demonstrable lie, severely damaged her credibility. On June 30, 1865, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. All 8 defendants were found guilty of conspiracy. The sentences were then announced. Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Loughlin, and Dr. Samuel Mudd were sentenced to life in prison. Edmund Spangler received a 6-year sentence. For 4 of the conspirators, the sentence was death by hanging: George Atzerodt, David Harold, Lewis Powell, and Mary Surratt. The death sentence for a woman shocked many, and a majority of the military judges signed a separate petition to President Johnson, recommending that he commute Mary Surratt's sentence to life in prison on account of her age and sex. Johnson would later claim he never saw the petition. On July 7, 1865, less than 3 months after the assassination, the 4 condemned prisoners were led to a gallows erected in the courtyard of the old Arsenal Penitentiary. Before a crowd of over 1,000 spectators, they were hanged, their bodies dropping in unison. Mary Surratt became the first woman to be executed by the United States federal government. Justice, swift and severe, had been served. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was more than the murder of a man. It was a crime against a nation's future. In dissecting the anatomy of this conspiracy, we find it was not a grand, sophisticated operation, but a rather ramshackle affair held together by the singular, magnetic obsession of one man. John Wilkes Booth was the sun around which a handful of misfits and malcontents orbited. He was the writer, director, and lead actor. His charisma was the conspiracy's engine. His vanity and theatrical narcissism, its fatal flaw. He imagined a world that would applaud his deed, a South that would rise up and call him a hero. He could not have been more wrong. The conspiracy succeeded in killing the president, but it failed in every one of its strategic objectives. It did not decapitate the government, which continued to function seamlessly. It did not incite chaos or reignite the war. In fact, it did the opposite. By murdering Lincoln at the very moment of his triumph, Booth martyred him, elevating him from a controversial wartime president to a secular saint, and by robbing the nation of Lincoln's vision of a merciful reunion, the assassination may have inadvertently paved the way for a harsher, more punitive era of Reconstruction, one that would deepen the very wounds Lincoln had hoped to heal. The military tribunal, with its questionable legal standing and vengeful haste, left a troubled legacy, particularly in the cases of Dr. Mudd and Mary Surratt, whose precise levels of guilt remain subjects of historical debate. In the end, the conspiracy that John Wilkes Booth architected was a reflection of the man himself. Dramatic, reckless, and ultimately self-defeating, it was a plot born of a lost cause's last, desperate gasp, fueled by a hatred that could not accept defeat. It was a conspiracy that succeeded in creating a void, but had no viable plan for what to build in its place. The shot that echoed from the presidential box did more than end a life. It murdered a possibility. It silenced the voice of reconciliation at the very moment it was needed most, leaving a wound on the nation's soul that would fester for a century to come, a testament to how a conspiracy born of theatrical vanity and political hatred could rewrite the final act of a country's history. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.